Hey everybody, you're listening to episode 16 of From Guns to Keyboards. We're back.
We're back.
It's been a while. I've just gotten back from a work trip to New York where a lot has happened. Interestingly enough, the news always seems more intense when you're abroad. You imagine Israel, everyone running out there with their heads on fire, and then you get back,
Right.
and everyone's waking up and going to work and getting lunch, and it's just another normal day in an incredibly abnormal situation.
Yeah.
With that being said, let's just jump right in. I think the headline news: two major assassinations back to back. So obviously, let's get into that one because those are the two biggest things. We have Fuad Shukar on July 30th met his untimely death at the hands of an Israeli fighter jet who bombed a building in the middle of Beirut. We'll get to that, but I believe it was it less than 24 hours later, Ismail Haniyeh,
Yeah.
the political head of Hamas, also met an untimely end, this time in the middle of Tehran, the beating heart of the quote-unquote resistance. And how he died is still a little bit of a question mark. Michael, you said you've heard how many?
Yeah, we've heard so far 3 conflicting reports.
Yeah.
It started off being reported as an airstrike, and then it turned into a report of the Mossad sneaking a bomb into the building
Right.
with the Revolutionary Guard assistants that planted a bomb in the building, and then it tapped off with an anti-tank missile that was supposedly shot from short range.
Yeah, so however it happened exactly, the results are all the same. He is confirmed dead. He had his funeral in Tehran with the Ayatollah himself presiding over it. So it's definitely a big deal. Shakes up well, I guess we'll talk more about the effects, but it certainly, I guess, reinforces in some extent Israel's deterrence.
And I guess we'll add to those 2 assassinations.
Icing on the cake.
Yeah, the third assassination that happened previously and was confirmed roughly around the time of Haniyeh's and Shukar's death, which is the assassination of Mohammed Dief.
Yep, the confirmed assassination. The IDF has confidently said that he has been killed. Hamas is still not saying anything one way or another, so no official confirmation from them, but the IDF feels confident enough to move forward. So obviously, with these 3 assassinations, we are now at a very tense moment, as we often are, waiting to see what the response of Iran, Hezbollah, and all their various proxies might be against Israel. Unlike the prior attack that happened back in early April and the response that happened on April 13th, the birthday bombing, as I like to call it, since it happened on my birthday, the Iranians aren't broadcasting anything. It's very much radio silence. There's certainly a lot of notifications going around from the Israeli government telling people, hey, be on alert, brace yourselves. That's it. That's basically the news we're getting from the government, and we'll certainly talk more about the Israeli government moving in. But first things first, let's talk about these assassinations. Michael, were you surprised when you read the news that Shukar and Haniyeh had both been killed?
I was definitely surprised, not out of the motivation, of course, of the Israelis. The Israelis, of course, have been looking to assassinate Hezbollah and Hamas and other Iranian Axis leaders for some time now, but the fact that it happened in such close proximity to one another in terms of time, alongside the confirmed assassination of Mohammed Dief, was a very pleasant surprise for all of us that were looking to, that are hoping for a Middle East without leaders of terror, whether it be in Hezbollah, Hamas, or in others. It definitely does beg a lot of questions regarding the situation in Iran, that somehow, whether it was Mossad agents or Revolutionary Guard officials that managed to get close to Haniyeh and kill him, or the situation in Lebanon where Israel managed to send one of its fighter jets over Beirut and destroy and assassinate a key Hezbollah operative. Definitely a lot of questions that Hezbollah and Iran are going to be asking themselves in the coming days that they've already been asking themselves. And I think that their response is going to be in accordance with those rough questions that they're going to be asking themselves about their own security situation.
Yeah, it does appear that Israel is very much trying to reassert its own measure of deterrence after the fiasco that was October 7th. I don't think it's fully reasserted, but it is a poke in the eye, definitely, to Iran, to Hezbollah. This notion that we can go after in the middle of your capitals, we can take out high-ranking figures who are well guarded, well protected. Supposedly, their locations are kept very secret from the ADF. That's clearly not true. It was, I mean, I'll give the security services credit where it's due. It was amazing intelligence gathering.
Yeah.
Haniyeh less so, obviously, because, they were broadcasting live where exactly he was, but just the fact that they had that either prepared or, I guess Haniyeh less so. But Shukar, definitely. And I guess let's start with him because, that was the first one that happened less than a week ago. So Shukar, just so everybody knows, he is... At the time of his death, he was basically the number 2 guy in Hezbollah. I think it might be helpful to think of him as like the Secretary of Defense, essentially. It would be very much the same as if someone were to assassinate the IDF Chief of Staff. This is how high up and important that this guy was. He very much started in Hezbollah back when it was formed in the early 1980s. He was considered the man responsible for the Beirut barracks bombing that killed over 250 U.S. Marines in 1983. He's very much been on the CIA hit list ever since. He's evaded death, capture for the past 40 years. And the fact that in the middle of a war, when everyone is, security is up and precautions are being taken, the fact that Israel can assassinate him, it's a tremendous intelligence feat. And it's certainly something that, again, it's like we mentioned, it's a huge poke in the eye to Hezbollah. I think you mentioned before how much Hezbollah really relies on the experience and on the leadership of many of its top officers.
Yeah, and I think, Hezbollah specifically, even more so than Hamas and other terrorist organizations, is a very hierarchical organization, meaning that the leadership of the organization, from Nasrallah down to all of his officers, is very centralized, very much focused on its top leadership going down. And it's not like other terrorist organizations, even Hamas for that matter, that knows how to operate in a very decentralized, more guerrilla manner in the Gaza Strip and elsewhere. Hezbollah has a very centralized and operated focus. And when you take out the number 2 in the organization, that's going to have a huge impact on their ability to function as an organization.
Yeah, I think it's worth also talking about, too, exactly why this happened, which was I don't know any other word for it, but the massacre in Majd al-Shams, which is a Druze village up in the north. It borders Lebanon. The Druze people largely refused to evacuate, despite the government and IDF warnings that they should. They're proud and tough people. And I got to hand to them, they really are, and they stayed. And essentially what happened is 2 days prior to this, 12 children were hit by a rocket, a Hezbollah rocket, while playing soccer, and died. 12 were killed. And I think more were wounded, actually, so it wasn't just 12. Obviously, it very much inflamed the country. It was headline news when it happened. It was devastating. Israelis, Jewish, Muslim, Druze were devastated to see this, and it was clear from the start that there was going to be some sort of reaction from the Israelis. That reaction was, it turned out to be very much the death of Shukar. And what was most surprising to me about that whole incident was Hezbollah, I consider Hezbollah to be a professional army in many ways. Hamas, they're kind of like gangsters. They're kind of thugs, gangsters. I don't really see them as being so professional. Even when they're fighting, honestly, even on October 7th, where we saw they were really only able to overcome IDF forces when IDF troops either ran out of ammunition or were just, overwhelmed by like a 10-1 odds kind of situation. They're not really that great of fighters. And what we saw too in Gaza ourselves was it was a lot of chicken shit, hit and runs kind of attacks. Anytime they were able to form into a cohesive unit, they were immediately wiped out by the IDF. It wasn't even a fair fight, honestly. Hezbollah is much different. Radwan in particular are extremely, extremely well trained to the point where IDF, there's a famous story going back into the late 2010s, I believe, where an IDF force encountered Radwan and mistakenly believed that they were fighting a U.S. Special Forces team because these guys were so well coordinated. Not only that, but Hezbollah, they publish when their fighters are killed. They don't keep the numbers to themselves the way Hamas does. They act the way a professional army would act. So the fact that when they launched that rocket, they lied about it, saying that it wasn't theirs, was, to be honest, I mean, look, every army lies. Don't get me wrong. Every organization is going to lie at some point if it benefits them. But it was a bit surprising. I think even Hezbollah realized that they crossed a big red line.
Yeah.
And that they did not want whatever was coming for them. And so they tried to lie about it as a way to kind of wiggle out of it. But the rocket was, after inspection, it was determined it was manufactured in Iran. There's only one group that's really getting these rockets on a regular basis, and that's Hezbollah.
Yeah. And I think here you bring up an interesting point where you connect both the lie of Hezbollah to the attack on Majd al-Shams, because the way I look at it, there's something of a triple embarrassment here for Hezbollah. The first embarrassment was shooting and hitting a Druze town, which is important to mention that there are many Druze living in Lebanon who looked at what Hezbollah did not with favor and basically realized that Hezbollah was striking one of their own. It's important to note on that side of things that while many Druze Israelis serve in the army, or I shouldn't even say many, all Druze Israeli men are drafted into the army. Specifically on the Golan Heights, the Druze that are living there in Majd al-Shams, where the strike took place, are kind of torn between getting closer to the Israeli authorities and Israeli government institutions and to their original country that they used to be a part of before the 1967 Six-Day War, Syria. And because of that reason, the fact that they not only hit a Druze town, but they also hit a Druze town that includes many residents that until today still identify with the Syrian regime was a huge embarrassment for Hezbollah. So that's embarrassment number one. Embarrassment number two was basically trying to cover up for this rocket attack and lie about it, where they originally did take responsibility for it, and then when they realized that they caused an enormous amount of damage and killed Druze kids, they realized that they need to walk back on what they said. So that's their second embarrassment, basically being caught on this obvious lie. And then embarrassment number three, this ends up with their number two being killed in a very central suburb of Beirut. A triple embarrassment for Hezbollah, bad news for the organization, all this coming right before an additional assassination against one of their allies, Hamas in Iran, against Haniyeh in Iran. Take all these embarrassments together, and looks like we're going to in for a very, very significant response from
there's no way that any military force can take these sorts of things lying down. One quick note as well about where the assassination actually took place of Shukar was it actually in a place called Dahiyah. And Dahiyah is very significant to Hezbollah. This is essentially like it's a suburb within Beirut, and this very much serves as Hezbollah's headquarters. You have a lot of, it's entirely controlled by Hezbollah. You have a lot of high-ranking Hezbollah politicians, officers who live in this suburb right here. A lot of intelligence gathering locations, and in the 2006 Lebanon War, this created the development of what's known as the Dahiyah Doctrine by Gadi Eisenkot, actually. And the Dahiyah Doctrine basically states that Israel will use disproportionate force against infrastructures that belonging to any kind of terrorist organization. All this to say that in 2006, Dahiyah was heavily bombarded by the Israeli Air Force. And the fact that Israel is striking this again it certainly, I think, kind of causes some concern amongst Hezbollah. This was considered one of the strategic moves that caused Hezbollah to pull back on a lot of their attacks and caused Israel to save some face in that 2006 war and pull out, even though by and large the 2006 was a loss for Israel. But it's a significant attack. It's a significant doctrine that continues to guide the Israelis today. So that's basically that with Shukar. And now Haniyeh. So obvious question. Haniyeh is not exactly, unlike Shukar, he's not a military man. He's a politician. He is the chairman of Hamas, very much like the president. Why? The Israelis have known where he's been since the beginning of this war, essentially. Why wait until now to take him out?
Well, you are correct in saying that while Shukar was more of a, many people described him as more of a chief of staff of the Hezbollah armed forces. Haniyeh is the head of the Hamas, was the head of the Hamas Political Bureau. I'm assuming that the Israelis did have some understanding of his movements and his location prior to his assassination. There's two basic theories that play here. Theory number one is that Israel wanted to keep Haniyeh alive for now out of some sort of fear of an immediate cost of assassinating Haniyeh, whether it would be the cost of carrying out an assassination on soil that would be problematic for Israel. A lot of the time Haniyeh was located in Qatar, which would be particularly problematic for Israel.
Why? Just can you explain why that would be particularly problematic?
Well, unlike Iran, which Israel is very clearly enemies with the Iranian regime, Qatar is kind of like a frenemy of Israel. It's a country that, on the one hand, funnels millions of dollars to Hamas, and on the other hand, acts as a broker to help Israel negotiate to release the hostages out of the Gaza Strip. And an assassination on Qatari soil is definitely in the cards, but there is a certain incentive at play there where the Israelis would feel a lot less comfortable at carrying out an attack on Qatari soil than in other areas where, from the Israeli perspective, it's more fair game. So that's one theory. The second theory is maybe just there wasn't an actual opportunity to go about doing it, and maybe the Israelis truly did try to do it, to go about carrying out the assassination, and they didn't succeed. And as I mentioned, two theories. I guess there should be kind of like a third hybrid theory that could be described between the both of them, which is that the Israelis, out of fear of cost, did not go about carrying out this assassination. But the reasoning did not have to do with the land that Haniyeh was located in, not because he was located in Qatar, but because of the fact that the Israelis wanted to keep Haniyeh around for the hostage negotiations, meaning that they viewed Haniyeh as kind of a moderate negotiator to push off against Sinwar in the Gaza Strip, the head of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And there might have been a fear for a certain amount of time that the assassination of Haniyeh would have been detrimental to those hostage talks.
It's interesting you say that, actually, because that is very much the narrative that a lot of the anti-Israel media is kind of pushing. That, not necessarily even anti-Israel, but just I don't want to say like anti in the sense that they're pro-Palestinian, but just very critical of Israel's actions. And that's been the narrative, is that, look, Haniyeh was a moderate. With him, you actually had a chance for hostage deal and hostage negotiation. At this point now, basically everyone in the higher echelons of the Hamas military and Hamas Political Bureau have been killed. You're basically left with Sinwar. Sinwar, who at this point is on by all reports, a messianic fervor after October 7th, who has zero incentive to do a hostage deal. And now he's your only guy you got to talk to. And with him, it complicates things because since he's located likely underground somewhere in Gaza, all communication with him can take upwards of weeks in order to get just even a simple answer out of him. So that is definitely a concern.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up an interesting point about the international criticism of this assassination and what were the motivations behind it. My personal opinion is I highly doubt that Israel would have let up at an opportunity to assassinate Ismail Haniyeh under previous rounds unless there's a very good reason to do so, meaning, I'll say it in simpler terms, I highly doubt that Bibi would have lost an opportunity for getting an enormous boost to his local public opinion polls and not assassinate Haniyeh because of some sort of desire to keep a moderate in power in Hamas and negotiate with them. I highly doubt that was the case. I think that if Haniyeh was around, the most likely scenario is one of lack of opportunity that only arose until recently. And maybe because of other considerations pertaining to strike on Qatari soil or other restrictions. But I highly doubt that Israel would have held that.
To be honest with you as well, I think that the chances of a hostage deal actually taking place with the most recent rounds of negotiation were incredibly low. Again, not to wave off the opportunity. Obviously, for many Israelis, any opportunity to have a hostage release is a chance worth taking. But I certainly, to be honest, don't believe that Haniyeh's death really changes the calculus of a hostage negotiation, a hostage deal. I don't think it was really in the cards for either side at this point. And the Israeli security apparatus, I mean, from the beginning of this war, from October 7th, basically made a public statement saying that all Hamas leaders were, I think to quote, dead men walking. Like, there was no way that this war was going to end. Or even if it did end, that there was no way that the Security Council was going to rest until Mohammed Dief, Ismail Haniyeh, and Sinwar, hopefully soon, were dead. That being said, I think it is worth speaking about as well, just the circumstances of Haniyeh's death, because it's one of the boldest moves I think we've seen. I mean, I can't even think of another Mossad operation that reached this kind of magnitude. So Haniyeh was in Tehran for the inauguration of Iran's newest president after Ibrahim Raisi met his untimely death in a helicopter. So the new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, which I'm sure I'm screwing up his name, happened on the 31st, and Haniyeh was there. He retired afterwards to his guest house that the Iranians had set up for him with his Iranian bodyguard, and several hours after the inauguration finished, Haniyeh is dead. How exactly it happened, Michael, as you said, it's a little bit up in the air. No one's quite so sure, but the fact that this could happen at likely one of the most secure Iranian events, the inauguration of president. I mean, we know how tight security gets at that point. And the fact that their honored guest from Hamas was killed along with an Iranian bodyguard, I mean, that is just a slap to the face of the Iranians. And they are furious. I think the day after, the Ayatollah himself basically said that there will be a response on Israeli soil. It will come from the Iranians. In addition to Hezbollah looking for revenge as well, looking to save face. It's honestly quite remarkable. Look, at the end of the day, Israelis were celebrating, and kind of to be honest, what I consider to be a little bit of a disgusting way. There are a lot of videos of Israelis going around handing out candies, very reminiscent of Hamas after October 7th, intentionally reminiscent of Hamas after October 7th. I think it's kind of gross, to be honest, especially when if you really want to get metaphorical. I mean, yeah, sure, October 7th they were handing out candies. How did October 8th look for them? Not great. I also but I understand, obviously, the satisfaction at his death. That being said, now Israelis are kind of sitting tight, waiting for some kind of response. And anything else you want to add to his assassination before we get into potential responses?
No, I think we can get into it. I think that, maybe one of the first things that we should mention about this potential response, even before getting into the nitty-gritty of what Iran and its allies are going to do and how exactly it's going to happen and when it's going to happen, is really the feeling in Israel, where you have this, correct me if you see it differently, you have this feeling on the street here where, on the one hand, as you mentioned in the beginning of the episode, people are continuing their lives per normal, going to work, doing what they need to do, picking up their kids from pre-K and going place to place as they normally do. But on the other hand, everybody's looking at one another with this feeling of tension, like we're waiting for the piano to fall on our faces.
Yeah, definitely. It's very reminiscent of what those first few weeks looked like in April, waiting for the response. And yeah, this one, I mean, look, we've seen the Air Force is on its highest alert. The U.S. just moved its third strike carrier group into the Mediterranean. The USS Abraham Lincoln, which is their largest carrier ship. They're anticipating something big. The leaked intelligence reports say that it's going to happen sometime in Tisha B'Av, which is between the 12th and 13th of this month as well, the day of mourning of the falling of the first temple. First or second temple, actually, I can't remember offhand, but one of the temples. And that something big will happen either direct from Iran and Hezbollah or with the quote-unquote Ring of Fire, launching attacks throughout Israel. In terms of what the response will look like, when I look at Hezbollah, one thing Nasrallah has kind of shown throughout this entire war is that he's a man of proportionality. So, for instance, he will attack Israeli civilians if a Lebanese civilian was attacked. And if it was a military target, he will try to attack a military target of equal value. He doesn't tend to go for escalation. So what that tells me is that ultimately my guess is he's going to attack a military installation, probably something in Haifa, which is much easier for Hezbollah to reach. It doesn't deplete their longer range arsenal of weapons that can hit throughout deeper areas into like Gush Dan and the Tel Aviv region. Iran is a different story, particularly as we've seen in just a couple weeks ago with the Houthis able to get one of their long-range drones to slip through Israeli defenses and blow up in the middle of Tel Aviv. My guess is going to be something that's much more sudden, abrupt, and probably something that takes place from launches that take place throughout Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Yemen. I think it's going to be, to be honest, my money is on them trying to hit the Kiryat, which is bad news for me because my apartment building lies right next to us. They may have to slice right there to get to the Kiryat, and I'm hoping it doesn't happen.
You'll have a great view.
I'll have a great view from my bunker or my safe room in the hallway, but yeah, it'll be definitely something interesting. Anyway, that's kind of my prediction. But at the end of the day, I also look. They've said that they don't want to start a war, so my guess is they're not going to go for major civilian infrastructure like power plants or hospitals or that kind of thing, because that's Israel's greatest fear, anyways. If a war starts, that these are the things that are going to get hit. So if they're already getting hit, then from Israel's perspective, it's like, okay, well, the thing we feared most from a war is already happening, so we're going to declare a war. I do believe it's going to be high-value military installations. There is also, by the way, the belief that they may not go for assets within Israel, but try and go for assets abroad, which Iran has had historically much more success, trying to assassinate Israeli ambassadors, blowing up embassies, that kind of thing. We'll see kind of what the prediction is, but what do you think is going to happen, Michael?
The way I look at it, the Iranians are going to respond in a way that will give an answer to their immediate goals. And the question is, what are Iran's goals? Because once you understand their goals, you can understand what they're going to do. The Iranians' first goal is to restore their honor. I think that's probably the most important thing for the Iranians, even more than deterrence. I think the Iranians need to restore their honor after facing a series of humiliations, both them themselves directly and their allies abroad. They need to have their moment like they did in April, where they do something very theatric and prove to their own base of support that they are big and strong, even stronger than the evil Zionists, and bring back their sense of pride that's so important to them. So I think that that's their first main goal. The second goal is deterrence. I would say it's a secondary goal for them, where they want to hit back at Israel and kind of extract a price for what the Israelis did. I don't think the Iranians actually think that they could fully deter Israel the way that they would ideally want to, because the sort of attack that they would need to do in order to deter Israel, I think, would be a full-on declaration of war in order to really shake the Israelis to their core. But I think that restoring some semblance of deterrence is definitely one of their goals here. And what those two goals play out together, the desire to restore honor and pride, and on the other hand, desire to restore some sort of semblance of deterrence, really does spell out the likely scenario, which is some sort of theatric attack coordinated in multiple theaters of battle. You mentioned some of them earlier, and I agree with you, whether it's on the northern front with Lebanon and Syria, or on the eastern front from Iran directly, or from Iraq, or from other areas like Yemen, and to really show the entire world and all of its supporters just how much it manages to bring this coalition of support together to destroy the Zionists. I think that the picture of victory is what's going to be most important to the Iranians here. And if they can have a picture of rockets coming in from every direction and hitting Israel at the same time, I think that that will be very important for the Iranians. I think it will be even more important than hitting one specific site or the other. Meaning, if they could hit the Kiryat or hit sites like that, I agree with you. That would be amazing from their perspective, and that would definitely restore their honor. But I think that the main thing that they're going to go for here is just massive scale, a lot of ammunition, a lot of theater, and hoping that it'll restore their sense of pride they lost.
Interesting. I agree with both what you said. To be honest, I think the deterrence and the sense of honor go a little bit hand in hand. What is deterrence essentially? It's causing the Israelis to think twice before carrying out a major attack in Tehran. The knowledge that, okay, we know what happened last time we tried something like this, so let's, maybe not. Like, for instance, the attack on the Iranian general inside of, I believe it was Syria, that brought us to the April, the birthday bombing, as I call it. It very much just caused the Israelis to think twice about it. That's all deterrence really is. It's not necessarily determining that nothing won't happen in the future, but just kind of making you really question if the juice is worth the squeeze, basically. And so I think for the Iranians, to be honest, if it is something kind of like what you said, like a shock and awe attack, I actually see it playing out over the course of several days, not just a single night like we saw in April, but actually several nights worth of drone rocket attacks to really kind of try and rattle the Israelis a little bit. Um, it's again, it's all theory at this point. The Iranians seem to not mind taking their time. I think they enjoy watching the Israelis shake a little bit and kind of that sort of psychological warfare of kind of trying to drive people into hysteria. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting next couple of weeks, to say the least.
I think you mentioned a couple of days of fighting with the Iranians, and I think that what the Israelis need to be aware of here in terms of its own considerations is how much is it really capable of carrying out a long-term war against the Iranians. And when I say long-term, even 2 to 3 days is a very significant amount of time to carry out a conflict with the Iranians. It should be worth of note that while the Israeli army has carried out very impressive feats over the past few weeks, or in the past week alone, in its multiple assassinations and targeted attacks, as I mentioned in previous episodes, the Israeli army is not really built for battle that takes place overseas in such a significant scale. It does know how to send in planes to do like what it did in Yemen, where it destroyed a port in Yemen and get revenge on the Houthis for doing what they did. And it does know how to do targeted attacks here and there. But the Israelis, at least to the best of my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, does not have the sort of long-range missile capability that the Iranians have. The Israelis never really invested in that the way the Iranians did. And if they're going to want to strike back at the Iranians, they're going to have to carry out a very different battle than the Iranians are. The Iranians can kind of shoot from far away and cause a lot of damage in a remote sense, and the Israelis are going to have to get up close and personal, either with people on the ground that it has both in a clandestine fashion and in an open fashion, and with fighter jets they're going to have to cross into Iranian territory and carry out strikes.
Which in and of itself, it poses another major challenge, because while Iran itself, I think we mentioned one of the episodes, their entire air force is basically all the leftover American planes from the 1980s. It's generally worthless. But one thing Iran has invested in as a result of that is very effective air defenses. Intelligence assessments say that Iran has incredibly effective anti-air deterrence, a lot of weaponry purchased from Russia and China as well, so very much top of the line. So Israeli fighter jets crossing on into Iranian soil will very much put those pilots at risk. There is a question, with the new Gen 5, F-35 jets, whether they will be able to move their way around them or not. I don't know if that's really a dice roll that Israel wants to make. But look, that being said, Israel has some long-range weaponry, not a lot, as I think you said it perfectly. The IDF is not built for that kind of attack. I think, and not just myself, but many people theorize that the Israeli dream scenario is to pull the Americans into this war. That the Americans, unlike the Israelis, have incredible long-range weaponry. I mean, the American army is a logistics juggernaut that can essentially have troops anywhere on the ground within 48 to 72 hours. Armored battalions, Air Force, Navy, logistics supplies for everybody. I think that the dream is to pull the Americans, and the Americans, of course, have spoken up about this. Lloyd Austin recently made a speech. Him and, by the way, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken are not in the Middle East. They're in East Asia right now. But from East Asia, they both made statements saying that while they would support Israel in a war, they're very much hoping that a war will not erupt. What that support would actually look like in practical means is a different story. I find it very hard to believe that Biden would approve of a full-out war against the Iranians, especially when he's just a few months away from his party going for an election, which is, despite Kamala Harris now front-running the race, it's still a bit neck and neck. And another war started by the Democrats. It just gives Trump another excuse to stand up and say, "Oh, this would never happen under my watch." And who knows if that's true or not. But it gives him the ammunition to say that and to tout the Democrats as the party of war. So for Israel's perspective, you're right. There's definitely not an appetite there for a war against Iran. The good news for us is that there's also not an appetite on the Iranian side either. They also don't want to drag the region into a war at a time where the regime is not at its strongest. I mean, we've seen over the past decade endless protests, sometimes violent protests, even on Iranian soil. And the fact that, we don't know exactly how this attack carried out, but we do know that the Iranians have begun rounding up various Republican guards within their, or revolutionary guards within the capital, shows that this is a regime that's not feeling super secure. And to have the internal instability of a war is, I don't think, something that the Iranians want either, and any more than we do. What's interesting about all this, and I do want to point out, is that, we spent the last 20 minutes talking about what's Hezbollah going to do, what's Iran going to do, what are the Houthis going to do. At no point do we ever mention what Hamas is going to do, and I think it's because Hamas, as as something that's a lethal force against the Israelis, has largely been decimated.
Yeah.
They even in the response to Haniyeh, there were, I believe, I read about 24 rockets that were launched at southern Israel. Only one was intercepted, not because the Israelis failed to intercept them, but because all the rest just landed in open areas. So the Israelis didn't feel the need to intercept them. Yeah. Hamas and again, we compare this to, let's say, like 2021, where Hamas launched rockets at Jerusalem and dragged everybody back into another several weeks of fighting. They were very much seen as a menacing threat. And now at this point, nothing. No one's concerned about what Hamas is going to do.
Yeah.
They really don't have any capabilities that they can do. It really is a show of just how, I don't want to say, at least how successful the Israeli military operation has been in disrupting Hamas's ability to function as a menacing unit to the Israelis.
Yeah.
That does bring us, though, to the larger question, because, look, while that's true, there are still thousands of IDF troops fighting in Gaza. Gaza is, on the one hand, it's kind of a sideshow, but it's such a resource drain to the Israelis that it's very much kind of the focus in another way, to the point where Israel can't really make too many moves in the north because of how bogged down it is in Gaza. So the question is, look, we've had these assassinations. You and I, we're not shedding any tears over these guys. These are men who, their deaths are, these are murderers. These are people who celebrate the rape and torture of innocent civilians. Their deaths, I'm going to sleep great. But the question is, does this help any kind of long-term strategy?
I think it definitely plays a critical part in Israel's long-term strategy to overturn Hamas and bring about some sort of regime change in the Gaza Strip. But as we've spoken about in previous episodes, using assassinations and military force alone is definitely not going to be enough for the Israelis here. The leadership of Israel, if it were to be perfectly wise about the situation, would couple these assassinations with a clear political alternative to Hamas in the Gaza Strip. That would be truly devastating to Hamas leadership in the Gaza Strip, to bring about an alternate civilian government in Gaza that comes about as Israel is going after and assassinating its leaders. I can definitely accept the counter-argument that I often hear to the political route, where many push back and say that no leader in their right mind would take responsibility for Gaza so long as the Hamas leadership is still in power, which I think that's largely an accurate counter-argument, and I would agree with that. But, as we spoke about in previous episodes, there's no simultaneous parallel track to these assassinations to even bring about some sort of better future in a civilian sense for the Gaza Strip and create the framework for an alternative to Hamas. And in the long run, this is going to bite Israel in the ass. The short-run victories feel great.
Yeah.
It boosts our ego. It makes us feel that we got our mojo back. But in the long run, it's not going to give us the full benefit of victory unless we create that alternative.
Extremely well said. And this is why I kind of equate the handing out of the candy after the death of Haniyeh to the handing out of the candy in Gaza post October 7th. It feels great in the moment, and you want to savor that victory, but the next day is not going to look pretty. Yeah. And I think that's something that the Israelis might have a rude awakening towards. I totally agree. I think this would have been, had there been some kind of political alternative, this could have been the catalyst that really showed the people of Gaza and the Palestinians in general, like, look, you can keep siding with Hamas if you want, they're biting the dust one after the other. They're not
Yeah.
safe, and you won't be safe either if you go with them. Or you can give up on some of your maximalist terms. You can submit to this other civilian body, which will work with us, but they're you guys, they're Palestinians, and together we can build a brighter, more peaceful future.
Yeah.
That would have been an amazing move. Because at the end of the day, exactly as you said, assassinations, they're a tool. They're not a strategy, it's a tactic. And while it can be used brilliantly in terms of a larger strategy, just assassinating people left and right the way that Israel likes to do is not going to bring about some kind of end to this war, some kind of settlement. And ultimately, it's what we want, especially if we consider that the major threat to us is in the north. Yeah. We need to get out of Gaza. And when you hear from the Prime Minister's office, basically all you hear is, well, we still need a couple more months to dismantle the remaining battalions in Rafah. And then word is they're talking, Bibi talked about recently having another year in Gaza to, quote unquote, clean up Gaza. What does that mean, clean up Gaza? Can you provide some specific actions you're going to be taking? Like, what is the day after going to look like? No one has those answers, which just kind of leads people down to this, this theory of, well, he's just prolonging the war to avoid elections.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, you see the economy in Israel is not doing so great. Recently, I read a report that schools in the Tel Aviv area in Gush Dan are closing, not because of lack of teachers, but because of lack of pupils. Families are taking their children and they're leaving. There's that brain drain that everybody was concerned about. It's happening. I have several colleagues who have moved abroad, and they've basically told the company, who does not allow for remote work, but they've basically told the company, look, I can either continue to work from abroad, because I'm not coming back, or you can fire me. Like, your call. It's very much turning into people are leaving, and how that's going to affect Israel in the long term in terms of its economic growth and prosperity. It's not going to look pretty. And there's a major concern. I think Israel has not a lot of time, particularly when it comes to Gaza, particularly if truly, as people are saying, the north is our biggest threat, then a move needs to be taken there.
Yeah.
And it's concerning.
Yeah, well, Israel historically was made famous for its very decisive and quick and immediate wars.
Absolutely.
And you compare the massive victory of the 6-day war, where in 6 days Israel conquers the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan
Triples
Heights.
in size overnight.
Triples in size overnight. Compare that to the fact that Israel is fighting an ongoing insurgency in the Gaza Strip alone for almost a year now is insane. And you couple that with the fact that, as you said, 70,000 Israelis from the north of Israel are evacuated from their homes as long as the ongoing center of gravity of this war is not getting the full attention that it deserves in the north. You have enemies on all corners, be it in the east from Iran and from the southeast from the Houthis in Yemen, that are looking to strike Israel from every place imaginable. The Israelis have to make a decision here about separating what ought to be the main focus for the war for the secondary focus of the war. It was clear that on October 7th, the main focus of the war had to be Gaza, had to be Hamas. Israel didn't really have the initiative to decide where the main front of the war should have been. But now it has to take the initiative into its own hands and make a decision. Now that initiative does not necessarily mean a full pull out of Gaza. That initiative might mean that Israel, if it can't reach a deal with Hamas or with some sort of alternate government in the Gaza Strip, that could mean pulling out a significant amount of its forces in Gaza, choosing certain areas like the Netzarim corridor and the border with Egypt that it wants to keep, and everybody else it takes out of Gaza and sends north. It doesn't have to be a full pullout.
It also might require some political bravery, which is very much lacking these days, and to give in to some of Hamas's demands in order to create that hostage deal, in order to create that peace agreement. I mean, Hezbollah has said repeatedly, we will stop firing once there's a peace agreement in Gaza.
Yeah.
That to at least create a moment of sort of peace, temporary peace. Obviously, it's not going to solve anything basically, except for bringing the hostages home, which I think is both a strategic and a moral imperative that Israel has, and allowing the Israelis to rest, recuperate, and prepare for what will, I think, likely one day be a very large, massive, and bloody war in southern Lebanon in order to push Hezbollah away from the border. I think that at this point, to be honest, Bibi kind of wants to kick that can down the road.
Yeah.
Because, like we mentioned, despite this, I know I said it last podcast, and I'm kind of eating crow a little bit because I said Bibi was not a risk taker, but the assassination of Haniyeh was a major risk, and the guy did take it. So I guess I'll give him kudos there where it's due, but by and large, Bibi's not a major risk taker, and fighting a war in Lebanon is there's not a clear outcome from that.
Yeah.
There's far from guarantee that Israel would win that war or win it decisively in any way. And so I don't necessarily think he wants to be the prime minister that sends IDF soldiers into southern Lebanon. I think he'd rather kick that can down the road a little bit and let somebody else take that fall when it eventually happens.
I think the only thing, I think you're right. I think the only thing that will push Bibi to declare war on Hezbollah will be the sort of humiliation that Israel felt on October 7th. Meaning that just like Bibi was not willing to declare a real full-on war on Hamas until the humiliation of October 7th and everything this country went through, I think that the only thing that will really push Israel to the point of war is if the Iranian allies attack on Israel, which is going to happen any day now, does bring us to a feeling of national humiliation. If that does happen, then we will respond with war. Otherwise, I think you're right. I don't see Bibi going about doing this. Going about declaring war. I want to tie back to a question or a topic that you mentioned earlier, which is surrounding the peace negotiations or the diplomatic track surrounding releasing hostages in the Gaza Strip, where I thought of a question when I was seeing these assassinations happening one after the other, whether it was the confirmed assassination of Mohammad Dief, the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Iran, the previous assassinations of the head of the Hamas in the West Bank of Aruri and also in Lebanon. At the same time, when Dief was killed, he was also killed with the brigade commander of Khan Yunis. This comes after other brigade commanders of Hamas were killed. And, you have to give the Israelis credit that on the one hand, they're really doing an amazing job in cleaning up much of the Hamas leadership, something that for the beginning of the war, it was doing a pretty terrible job at.
Mm-hmm.
But I did ask myself the question, if Sinwar is really the only guy left in power on Gaza Strip, or at least in the military side of Hamas in power in the Gaza Strip, if Israel takes out Sinwar, who else does it have to negotiate with? Meaning, who is even in power in the Gaza Strip to release hostages on the other side? I don't have a good answer to this question. I genuinely have no idea who the Israelis can speak with. Even if we look at it from a hierarchy standpoint, his quote-unquote number one abroad was killed. His number 2 and number 3 have already been killed. Both Mohammad Dief and his number 3 have been removed from power in the Gaza Strip. 2 of his brigade commanders have been killed. If Sinwar is taken out next, who is left to negotiate with in the Gaza Strip?
Well, we already know that the Hamas is in the business of picking Haniyeh's successor, and I believe it's between 2 men at this point. I don't know that the names or details. I just recall reading that essentially they do have 2 candidates for becoming chairman of Hamas. I would assume with Sinwar it's the same situation. That yes, he doesn't quite have Sinwar's prestige, and that in itself might make maintaining Hamas a unified front quite difficult, kind of how you mentioned. That if you have someone who was not even, let's say, the rank of what would be the equivalent of general when October 7th happened, how much authority does this person have? How much prestige does this person have in order to maintain a single cohesion within Hamas? It's a very good question, actually.
And also, going off of the potential successors to Haniyeh, let's say, for example, Khaled Mishal, who was one of the names being tossed around. He's the current head of Hamas's. There's a general range of Hamas for everything that's not the West Bank, not Gaza, and not in an Israeli prison. It's basically the head of everything else. So that's Khaled Mishal.
So what the Qatari penthouse is?
He's basically in charge of. he gets paid a lot of money to hold some sort of random portfolio that it's the Palestinians everywhere else. The Palestinians in Lebanon, the Palestinians in Syria.
The diaspora.
He holds the portfolio of the entire Palestinian diaspora, everything that's not West Bank, Gaza, or Israeli prisons. He was the former head of Hamas's Politburo. Was replaced by Haniyeh, and it looks like he might be one of the potential candidates to come back. Let's say that Mishal comes back into the picture and retakes the reins of his previous job and takes over Hamas Politburo. I don't know if the leadership on the ground in the Gaza Strip, meaning the individual battalion commanders of Hamas in the Gaza Strip and their subordinate company commanders are going to take barking orders from Eshal. I think that, we saw in the previous rounds of negotiations, and you alluded to this a second ago when you spoke about a strong military figure that can kind of unite the fighters on the Hamas side in Gaza. Every time Ismail Haniyeh got a proposal or some sort of outline for the negotiations from the Israelis, one of the first things that he did was pass it along to Sinwar.
Right.
Sinwar basically had a de facto
You're absolutely
veto
right.
over everything that came through, because it was very clear that Haniyeh and all of the boys in Qatar that are living the life and eating very delicious steak in a nice hotel in Qatar are disconnected from the situation on the ground in the Gaza Strip, and they don't have full control of the situation. And the guy who really says what goes one way or another is Sinwar. Sinwar's taken out. I don't know if they'll take barking orders from Qatar like the way they used to.
I wonder if in that scenario, because why was Sinwar kind of making the final call? Because he actually has his hands on the hostages. Haniyeh can say all he wants, but he doesn't have any physical control over any of the hostages.
I don't even think he knows where the hostages were. I don't think, but when Haniyeh died, I'm guessing here. I really don't know. But if you had to make me, put money down and guess, I would say that nobody in Qatar, in the Hamas leadership, has a real understanding of where the hostages are located.
I believe it. And I think that also, by the way, sets up another difficult obstacle to overcome, which is probably very few men inside of Gaza actually do know where all the hostages are. And if you start killing all of them, then collecting them for some kind of hostage deal is going to be basically just logistically impossible. Even if they all agree that they want to, none of them may have any idea where everybody is, and that in itself poses a whole other challenge. But yeah, it makes sense for a guy like Sinwar. He's making the final call because he's the only guy who can actually release them. He actually has his hands on them and can decide what happens to them. If he's taking another picture, and it's a problem. It's a huge problem for the Israelis. I think it's been quite clear, though, that the Israelis, Netanyahu, I would say, actually, has little to no interest in a hostage negotiation. There's a leaked report after a call with Biden where Biden said, I quote, "Stop bullshitting me, Bibi," in regards to Netanyahu telling him that Israel is taking every possible step in order to facilitate a hostage deal. Nobody believes this guy is doing anything. There's constant leaks to the press from various members in his own cabinet that he's not interested in a hostage deal, that he very much wants to prolong the war. And I think that leads us to perhaps what might be our final topic of discussion, which is a massive, massive internal turmoil within Israeli politics. So, just a quick overview, and Michael, please feel free to add any details. There are many leaks coming out of the Prime Minister's office that the Defense Minister Gallant will be fired by Bibi, something that Bibi tried to do in March 2023, which sparked massive protests all over Israel, and he was unsuccessful. But at this time around, he feels confident enough that he can fire him, that he can fire Herzl Halevi, the IDF chief of staff, and that he can fire Ronan Bar, the commander of the Shin Bet. That these three men, he can fire them, he can replace them with people who are much more, let's say, accommodating to his needs and to his desires, and essentially then put all the blame of October 7th on those three men. Do we think that's likely to happen? What are your thoughts on this? Or is he likely to succeed even?
I think that anything is possible with Bibi. It's all a question of whether or not it serves his political interest or not. I think that Bibi is not going to make a move, at least until the situation with Iran, or the immediate threat of Iran is going to be handled. Once that situation is put under control, I think if I had to make a guess, Bibi is going to try to make a move to, at the minimum, replace Gallant and remove him and put in power another defense minister in his step. Gideon Sa'ar is one name that's been tossed around.
Yeah, that's what I've been hearing a lot too.
There's other names that are also being tossed around. Israel Katz, other potential defense minister positions. Bibi might use the portfolio as a way to bring more members into his coalition and to stabilize the coalition in the face of the instability that is brought about by more radical elements of his coalition, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and others. I think that that's a very likely scenario to happen sometime in the next few months. I think that the replacement of the chief of staff and the head of the Shin Bet is possible, but at a lower level of likelihood. And I think it's lower level because there's a certain understanding, at least in Israel, that politicians are more fair game to hire and fire than the professional branch. I think if Bibi could do it, he would love to. I think he wants to get rid of these people.
For sure.
So, I think that, there's a gap here between what most Israelis would accept and what Bibi would ideally like to do. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to Bibi's self-political interest, and I think that Bibi's gonna try to figure out the way to not push the envelope too far as to create massive public turmoil the way he did with the previous attempt to fire Gallant, and slowly do the things that is in his immediate grasp to do.
Well, one thing I will say when we compare now to March 2023, a year and a half ago almost, is that back then there was already this huge momentum of anti-government protests or anti-Bibi protests essentially. So it wasn't a huge leap when you started seeing major institutions joining the anti-Bibi protest movement, which is ultimately happened. Like the largest union within Israel, Hezbollah, joined in as well, and that was a big factor right there because Hezbollah controls a lot of public labor and private labor as well, honestly, within Israel. So them going on strike as well shut down most of the country. It was it basically forced Bibi's hand to rescind the firing of Gallant. Today, that movement doesn't exist. There is not there are protests, of course, don't get me wrong. I see them from my balcony every Saturday night. It is not even close to the same momentum that it was a year and a half ago. Most Israelis, I think, have just become a little cynical, honestly, and a little bit just kind of lackluster in their belief that such an approach will make any movement on the government. And many just also believe that it's just not an appropriate time when the country's at war. So that gives to Netanyahu a little bit more free reign, I think, than he had a year and a half ago. And if he does decide to make such a dramatic move and fire, certain members of the security cabinet, I think he will likely get away with it.
Yeah, and I think that I agree with you that his position's a little bit stronger now than it was previously. Gallant specifically, I think, has a certain perception in the Israeli public of being one of the few members of Israel's Likud party that is acceptable to the greater public, meaning he is not just someone who follows in right-wing circles and has his own base of support the way that Netanyahu and other members of the right do. Gallant is looked upon by many in the center and even many in the left as being more acceptable leader, a defense minister that, while he is not real prime minister material, does have the ability of demonstrating some degree of statesmanship that other leaders in Israel's current political leadership do not have the ability to show. And I think that for many Israelis, the initial decision to fire Gallant in March 2023 was really touching one of the last guards of something that was moderate in the Likud. It was the last moderate member of the Likud that was really in power at the time, and Netanyahu's decision to fire Gallant in March 2023 was really a non-starter for many Israelis and was a huge blow to those who really saw the political leadership going under its final transformation to pure radicalism, to pure Ben Gvir, to pure Smotrich, to pure Netanyahu. But I agree with you. Once, with all the conditions that you mentioned, the time is much more ripe for Bibi to fire members of the security establishment, be it Gallant or others, especially coming after multiple assassinations. Bibi is looking very strong. He's looking very much in control. He's also kind of showing to many of those who criticized him for not going for a deal with Hamas, a hostage deal with Hamas, that it was actually worth it for him to stick it out and to continue fighting for what he believed in, because at the end of the day, maybe these assassinations wouldn't have happened had Bibi not put his foot down and tried to stick it out even further. So Bibi's in a very strong point right now. His enemies are not in a strong point, both enemies domestically and internationally. And he's definitely going to play this to his political advantage.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it'll be, like it always is, it'll be an interesting next few weeks. I think at that note, guys, girls, thank you so much for listening. Stay safe, stay optimistic. I know it's tough, but stay optimistic, and we will as well. And we'll see you guys soon.